being one of the first philosophers to center human subjectivity as the foundation of truth, to openly challenge the mechanistic rationalism of Hegelianism, and to introduce personal faith, anxiety, and despair as core philosophical concepts. Kierkegaard was born in 1813 in Copenhagen, Denmark, into a wealthy, deeply religious household. His father, Michael Kierkegaard, was a stern and melancholic man, a former shepherd who, through shrewd investments and business, rose to prosperity. But that prosperity was shadowed by guilt. Having once cursed God in his youth, his father became obsessed with the belief that he and his family were doomed to divine punishments. This dark, almost job-like worldview would set away to Kierkegaard's early years, laying the foundation of the themes of suffering, guilt, and inward struggle that would define his life and work. As a child, Søren was unusually introspective and philosophically inclined. Rather than playing outdoors, he preferred the solitude of thought, often wandering through the streets of Copenhagen alone, immersed in books, faith, and private reflection. By the time he reached university, he had already become something of a religious prodigy. He enrolled at the University of Copenhagen to study theology, but he soon found academic life uninspiring and overly detached from the real trials of human life. Though brilliant, he delayed his graduation for nearly a decade, not out of laziness, but inner turmoil. He struggled with the idea of becoming a public figure of faith while wrestling with his own spiritual crisis. And then came Regine Olsen, a young woman he loved deeply and who loved him in return. In 1840, he proposed marriage. She said yes, but soon after, Kierkegaard ended the engagement, not out of coldness or disinterest, but from a belief that his life's purpose required solitude and suffering. He felt unworthy of her, haunted by the sense that his melancholia would poison their union. This moment, more than perhaps any other, fractured his life into two paths: the man he could have been and the philosopher he would become. From that point on, Kierkegaard threw himself into writing, fiercely, privately, and obsessively. Between 1843 and 1855, he published over 20 works, often under pseudonyms, each representing a different voice, philosophy, or a state of mind. These weren't just pen names, they were carefully constructed psychological profiles, each embodying a way of living or avoiding life. Through this fragmented style, Kierkegaard explored the tension between aesthetic pleasure, ethical duty, and religious faith. In his view, life could be lived in three stages. First, the aesthetic, where one chases beauty, novelty, and entertainment, but remains ultimately empty and despairing. Second, the ethical, where one accepts responsibility, lives by moral commitment, but still finds no final fulfillment. And third, the religious, where the individual, through a leap of faith, stands alone before God, in paradox, absurdity, and in inward truth. For Kierkegaard, faith was not rational certainty. It was absurd, a leap into the unknown against all logic, all societal expectations, all comforts of the mind. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, he argued in fear and trembling, was not the moral action, but a religious one, a terrifying, solitary act of faith that defied ethics, yet revealed something deeper. This idea that the individual must suffer, doubt, and confront the absurd placed Kierkegaard at the odds with nearly every intellectual of his day, especially Hegel, whose grand system claimed to resolve contradictions into a universal rational unity. Kierkegaard rejected this. He believed that system building in philosophy ignored the reality of existence, which is always lived subjectively, in dread, in passion, and in the silence of God. He wrote through sickness into death. The despair of not being one's true self, of living inauthentically, cut off the eternal. He believed despair wasn't a flaw to be cured, but a fundamental condition of being human, a sign that we are more than nature, more than logic, and that we are endlessly called towards becoming who we truly are. And yet in his own life, Kierkegaard was largely ignored, ridiculed by Danish society, mocked by satirical papers, and dismissed by the very religious leaders he sought to awaken. He died in 1855 at the age of 42 from complications related to a spinal disease, alone and estranged from the church he both loved and criticized. Kierkegaard's influence would explode. He would go on to inspire thinkers like Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and countless psychologists and theologians. His work laid the groundwork for existentialism and even major stands of depth psychology. He was in many ways the philosopher of inner crisis, of the dark nights of the soul, of that silent confrontation between the finite and the infinite, between the self and the God it may never fully understand. Where Hegel sought resolution, Kierkegaard embraced contradiction. Where system tried to answer, he insisted on questioning. Where others philosophized in the abstract, he demanded that philosophy descend into the real, into the anxious, trembling hearts of human being. His work, to some, is maddening, filled with riddles, masks, and paradox. But to others, it is liberating. It says that suffering is not meaningless, that faith is not childish, and that truth is not handed down, but lived alone, painfully, courageously. As Kierkegaard once wrote, the most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you would never have. And yet, in this pain, there is something secret, something eternal, something cannot be taught, only chosen.